All right, thanks, Wendy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Wendy said, I'm Tony Bergantino. I'm director of the Wyoming State Climate Office and the Water Resources Data System. And welcome to our 35th Conditions and Outlooks briefing. We've racked up a number of these. It was a nice sunny day here in Laramie and was just getting used to it, but clouds are starting to move in. Well, the presentation today, it comes from my office as well as the University of Wyoming Extension, USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub, US Geological Survey, Wyoming Department of Agriculture, the National Weather Service office in Cheyenne, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Land Management. And today we'll be looking at the current drought, climate conditions, surface water conditions, reservoir operations, some weather forecasts, outlooks, and then that'll be all followed by a look at agricultural stress on humans and programs that can help there. So jumping into current conditions, let's go to the current drought monitor map, valid as of this Tuesday, the 23rd. I've seen a fair amount of improvement since the last webinar with a decline of D2 or severe drought up in the Northeast. Much of the D0 or abnormally dry conditions in the south central part of Wyoming have disappeared as well. And thanks to some systems that came through in late March and early April, also some up in the eastern areas here. Unfortunately, we did see a bit of a decline in the central part of the Bighorn Basin where some abnormally dry conditions were introduced, but that was just sort of along the line extending into the basin and somewhat of a correction there. So comparing where we were a year ago continues to show just how fluid drought is in Wyoming and everywhere else. Many areas out in drought this time of last year are, they're clear this year, and the same holds in reverse where the Bighorns now are in D2 or severe drought, but we're drought free at this time in 2023. If you squint and look at the legends real close, it's good to see that the absolute percentage of each of those categories of drought are less now than they were a year ago. And there's none of that D3 or extreme drought present. The lower percentages are good for the state as a whole, but your area may be worse than last year, especially along the northern tier of the state. And that's just when you look at the state as a whole, a percentage doesn't really mean much until you get into your area, and that's where it counts, is in your neighborhood. We've added a few more data points to the graph since the last webinar. Unfortunately, those extra points are starting to show a decline in the area affected. Just under 20% of the state is in actual drought, those D1 to D4 or moderate to exceptional drought categories. When you consider the areas flagged as abnormally dry or D0, that percentage goes up about 43, almost 43.4% of the state being affected. And that 19.93% in D1 to D4 is a decline of 5.29 from the last webinar. And the total affected area, that 43.39, that went down 10 2/3% from the last time we talked. As we get into summer, though, that could stop and flip around, unfortunately. Here is a bit more detailed look at the last 4+ years or so, starting in January of 2020. You can see the recent improvements at a bit better here with the scale the way it is. Only 2.44% of the state being in severe drought now, and that being primarily the Bighorns. That 2.44 is a decline of just over 4.25% from our last webinar. Our zoom in showing January 2020 to present shows more detail, obviously, and the full time period, like we saw on the last slide, those are available and updated weekly, as I said, statewide, and also for individual counties at the link down there on the lower left. 14-day precipitation. This is precip over the last 2 weeks in terms of percentiles, and unfortunately a lot of yellows, oranges, and reds, and even some deep reds showing. Those deeper reds are in the lowest 5 percentiles and cover quite a bit of the west, and then up in northern Campbell counties and a few scattered areas around the state. Those gray areas are above the median, with the scant few green and blue areas being seen are above the median. And those areas are mostly thanks to some heavier precipitation amounts that fell around the 15th through about the 17th of April. Otherwise, precip was fairly scattered and minimal over the last 2 weeks. Kicking back 90 days or about 3 months shows a better picture, with quite a bit of Wyoming being in the above median percentiles, with some south central parts being at or above the 90th percentile. The northeast, with a few exceptions, is mostly median to below median, while the northern winds and Tetons also stick out as being in those lower percentiles. For a look at two different types of years, two different time frames: the water year on the left, which starts on October 1st, and the calendar year on the right, which naturally starts on January 1st. As the length of time gets longer, these two maps have converged a bit as far as how they look, with the Southwest and Bighorn Basin standing out in both as being above median. Northwest also shows similarities, with both being below median, as is the Northeast, with the larger area of below median being in the calendar year map. The border areas, between Platte and Goshen, where they meet Laramie County, is similar in both of these depictions as well. And here we have the standardized precipitation index maps, 30 days, showing that lack of precipitation we saw earlier in the west, especially, but also along the southern reaches. At 60 days, the picture is better, indicating that the deterioration is more recent, unfortunately. The 1 year on the bottom right still has a lot of that influence from the very wet spring and summer last year, and looks pretty wet except some minor areas in the south and northwest. Getting out the thermometers instead of the rain gauge, let's take a look at the average minimum temperature over the last 14 days or 2 weeks. On the upper left or upper right actually, is the actual temperature. Large areas of Fremont County, Bighorn Basin, and Northeast and East have seen minimums barely getting down to the freezing part now. On the lower left, the map shows the departure from average, and a fairly mixed bag here, with higher elevations and much of the east being up to 3 degrees below average, with the remainder of the state being about 3 degrees above average up to that. Some parts of Uinta County did see average minimums as much as 6 degrees above average. For daytime highs, map on the upper right again, that's the actual average temperature over the last 2 weeks. Highs were above the freezing point statewide, other than maybe a few blips that really aren't discernible here that were under 32 Fahrenheit. Average highs in the 60s were felt in the Eastern Plains, parts of the Wind Bighorn, as well as the lower Green. In terms of that departure from average, down here on the lower left, generally west of the divide, except for the higher elevations, was up to 6 degrees above average, and those higher departures were also seen a bit up in the far east and northeast. The remainder up to 3 degrees above average, except for some parts of the northern Bighorns and the southern Bighorn Basin. Jump over here to soil moisture. We're continuing to lose ground, pardon the pun, in soil moisture, with large expanses declining in the last 2 weeks, especially there in the northeast. That large swath going over here is going to the median, and some south and central parts, though other areas are also losing soil moisture as well. So it's I didn't see any real areas that improved in the last 2 weeks. Snowpack by basin, here's today on the right, and then on the left, the map is from 1 year ago on the state. And while we do have 4 basins, the Upper Bear, the Little Snake, the Upper North Platte, and the Laramie Basin there, here in green, meaning that they're within about 10% of median. All the basins in the state are below where they were this date last year. As you can see, those colors are all not as good as they are on the left. However, now that we're in that melt out stage, these percentages can change quite a bit from day to day, as the graph of snow water equivalent can be pretty steep right now. And it doesn't take much of an offset from the median line to have the percentages differ by quite a few points. And these are showing the remote sensed interpolated snow water equivalent across the state, so showing a finer area detail than just one number for a large basin. Last year, we still had quite a bit of that lower elevation snow lingering in the southwest, which is missing from today's map. And generally, as one would expect from the last maps, the snowpack is down statewide from last year when you look at this around the entire state here. And this is showing that departure from median snowpack. That's it's in terms of snow water equivalent from inches. It's just the median subtracted from what we have now. And unfortunately, you see these deep reds, those areas are well under the median, while the bright purples that we do have in some areas, fortunately, are showing areas well above, but not enough of the greens and blues on the map for my liking. All right, looking at the basin peak snow water equivalent, this gives a good status of the basins as we move into the season, and then it serves as a summary of the snow season as we go into meltout. It shows each of the 19 basins in the state and where they are currently in terms of relative to the peak snow water equivalent for the current season. Blues are above median, both in terms of any of the dates that are shown or values, and red are below median, also for dates and values. And looking at the second column, we see the date that each basin reached its peak snow water equivalent. If that date is in blue, it was later than the median date. And if red, it was early. And only 3 basins reached their peak earlier or later than the median. And those were all around the 8th and 9th of April. That third column shows what the peak was in terms of actual inches of water. And we can see that 4 basins are in blue, meaning their peaks were higher than the median peak over the duration of that station's history. 2 of those, the Little Snake and the Lower Green, coincide with later peak dates, but the others do not. The next 2 columns just show how many days earlier or later the peak was, and then how many inches higher or lower that peak was. The 6th column there shows that peak in terms of a percentage of the median peak. The Little Snake was the highest, which had a peak of 112% of median, while the Belle Fourche was the lowest, coming in at only 48% of median. And the final columns give some stats on what was the median peak dates, the amounts, and then just when that median meltout date is for each of those basins. Each of those last 3 columns there have, you can see where that IMG in yellow is. If you click on that, it's accompanied by a chart that shows just how the year performed. And then that chart goes back, in most cases, back into the early 1980s. And we'll just look at 2 of those. Here's our poor performer this year, the powder on the left, and our peak performer, which is the Little Snake. And you can see by the gray line on the Little Snake that it was our peak performer last year as well. The black line shows this year, and you can see that the peak goes up and above that green circle. And you can see that it reached the value of that green circle a few weeks back, circled there in blue. On the left is the same chart for the Powder River Basin. You can see by comparing that black line from this year and the red line, which is the minimum snow water equivalent for each date going forward, that this basin set new record minimums for much of the season. Those events around the first part of April were about the only thing that kicked it up above the minimum, and it tried to make a run for the median, but failed miserably, really, and started to drop off fairly quick. Its peak did occur this year fairly close to when the median peak normally does, but unfortunately it was low, and when this basin started to melt out, not much chance of it going back up there too much higher. And since we're just speaking of melt out, I will now pass the baton to our next speaker, and that person is Aaron Fiaschetti with the USGS, who's going to talk about surface water conditions. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks, Tony. So here's a look at a screenshot from the National Water Information Dashboard, just kind of giving the idea of conditions in the state. The greens are a normal condition that ranges from the 25th to the 75th percentile, above normal 76th to the 90th. And then much above normal is the dark blue. We only have a few of those, and that's above the 90th. So in general, most things are normal or above right now as things start to melt out. And we do have one that's much below normal, and that's Pacific Creek down there north of Rock Springs. So moving on, Tony, So this is a 7-day duration hydrograph, and the vertical axis is a 7-day average runoff in millimeters. So that's like a runoff divided by drainage area. So, but the point of this, and we're looking at this black line, is to show the conditions where we are, and we're starting the upward swing of getting into runoff right now. So we're all of our sites are reporting. Usually we have one in ice. It was up in the encampment. That should probably come out of ice pretty soon. And right now conditions are above normal, but we'll just kind of take that with a grain of salt. That is, things come off maybe a little bit earlier or quicker. It can make it look a little bit rosier than it actually is if you don't have a whole lot of snowpack up there to fill reservoirs and irrigate fields. So we're coming into the time where the bulk of the volume for the water year comes off here in the next month and a half. So moving on. So just kind of bouncing around the state, taking a look at the North Fork Shoshone up in the northwest, that kind of see coming in here into March and April. We've had a few kind of bumps in the hydrograph as either things melted out or we got some precip. So it's kind of been on a kind of a spiky swing up, but we're kind of well into our way of approaching some higher flows in the basin in a time of good water supply right now. What kind of remains to be seen how much of that water actually makes it up to that peak of the hydrograph that usually occurs into June. And there's luckily more than one way to put together a good water year than just snow if we get some rain. So hopefully that comes to fruition. So moving on to the Powder, middle fork of the Powder near Barnum. So kind of looking at flows coming kind of spiky too, like we saw on the other side where we got a few spikes coming into March, April as things melt out and lower elevations or some precipitation moves in, and things have gotten, well above normal in that basin and a couple spikes there, and will remain to be seen what happens next if it continues to rain or any additional snow melts out and kind of drives those flows to follow a more normal trend for the hydrograph here. And then moving down to the North Platte above Seminole, things look pretty good. It had good flows all winter long, and then things are just kind of bumping up. Had a little bit of a higher spike recently here as we started to get some good runoff, and so far things look pretty reasonable down there in the North Platte. And then moving over to the Snake River above Jackson Lake, kind of see things were chugging along a little bit lower over the winter period, closer to that 25th percentile. And then we had a bit of a spike there in early April, a bit higher elevation, a little bit more delayed start of runoff at that site compared to some of the others, like the middle fork of the Powder. So just moving on to reservoirs right now, compared to last month, since water just started kind of coming off in earnest real recently. Not a lot of change over the reservoirs from the state, just minor plus or minus changes. Most are 60 to 80% full. Of note that seems like Fontenelle's being lowered. It's dropped 40% since November. And right now, Palisades is being lowered a bit. It's dropped 13% since last month. So that's all I have, Tony. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. And continuing with surface water, reservoir operations specifically, we go to Liz Cresto with the Bureau of Reclamation. Liz.
All right, let's start off with the Bighorn system. We have good carryover in the Bighorn, and reservoirs are sitting pretty good this time of year. Bull Lake is 49% full, which is 96% of average. Buffalo Bill is 73% full, or 116% of average, and Boise is 78% full, or 111% of average. And the next slide, I guess I will note that we are planning on, or anticipating that we'll have enough runoff to fill the reservoirs in the Bighorn side. As long as things don't dry out drastically, we should be okay there. And in terms of current releases, that's what you're seeing on this slide. Buffalo Bill, we're releasing 1,680 CFS. Boise, we're releasing 2,200 CFS, and Bull Lake, we're releasing 31 CFS. I don't anticipate any changes for at least another week or so. On May 1, we'll do a new updated water supply forecast for the period May through June, and then we'll start planning whether or not we're going to be upping or lowering the flows from the reservoirs to manage reservoir fill. So I do anticipate those flows will be changing throughout the spring runoff season. So let's switch to the North Platte, which is the next slide. North Platte is sitting pretty well too, going off of a good water year. They have good carryover. So you see Seminole and Pathfinder are our biggest reservoirs. They're both 64 and 68% full, which equates to 120 to 113% of average. Glendow is 85% full or 94% of average, and Guernsey's 53% full or 92% of average. We anticipate we'll get some fill of Seminole and Pathfinder this year, but probably we won't top those reservoirs off. But we do anticipate there'll be enough water for that we won't have an allocation year for water deliveries. So this shows our current releases. So Seminole Cordis releases are 2,000 CFS, and they'll go up to about 2,600 CFS sometime in May. Gray Reef's at 800 CFS, and the releases are expected to increase in May to fill Glendow Reservoir and to meet irrigation demand released from Glendow and Guernsey. Then we're releasing 1,250 to fill Guernsey, and 950 releases are being from Guernsey to fill the inland lakes. And during the May hay run, water deliveries from Guernsey could reach 3,500 CFS, and demand is expected to taper off during early June before the demand comes back during like the regular irrigation season. And then we'll just have to see how the summer plays out. If it's dry and hot, expect high demands, but we'll address that when the time comes. But we should have enough water supply on that North Platte system.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And next up, we have Tony Anderson, who's with the National Weather Service over in Cheyenne, to look what we can expect over the coming weeks and beyond. Tony?
Thank you, Tony. Good afternoon, everyone. This is just our first slide just depicts kind of what our annual weather hazards look like during a given or during a normal year. And then we highlight there in the middle the current season and what the most likely weather hazards you're going to experience are. And so for right now, it's as you would expect. We're moving into the springtime. We're moving into the convective season. So severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, especially hail, and then hopefully maybe a little river flooding but not flash flooding. We don't want flash flooding, but hopefully we'll get enough water that we may have to worry about a little bit about some of it getting out of hand. But those are the big concerns right now. Next slide. So we're going to look, first of all, at what we're expecting over the next 7 days. And it's actually pretty good news. There is a widespread system going to be coming across the Four Corners area and delivering water almost across the state. More so in the southeast and across the south, but everybody looks like they should be getting some. And we could be looking at as much as an inch of rain or snow water equivalent, depending on where you are, during the course of the next 3 or 4 days. And then we got another system coming in later in the 7-day period. So there's should be multiple systems affecting us, and we should be seeing I would expect some drought relief with this, unless we just hold our own because it is springtime. But as normal during this time of year, in the higher elevations above 8 or 9,000 feet, this should fall as snow. So it will be supplementing snowpack, not depleting it. And then in the lower elevations, we should be getting soil saturating moisture across a good chunk of the state. If you look at the color schemes, the blue colors are actually starting at the second blue color. That's 3/4 of an inch or greater. And there's a lot of the state covered above that. So we could be looking at some good rainfall in the next 3 to 4 days, and then certainly over the next 7. Next slide. Looking out beyond 7 days into that 8 to 14 day time period, the week 2 basically, we're looking at a more probabilistic outlook instead of deterministic like we saw before, where we're actually giving you precipitation values. Here we're just trying to look at probabilities. And in this case, over on the left-hand side, the temperature outlook is showing basically a weak to a strong signal for above normal temperatures over the course of this week, the next week 2 from now. And that's kind of continuing the beautiful spring that we've been having. But that signal strengthens, it's weaker in the west, and then it strengthens towards the east into what is a fairly strong signal over almost half the state, or maybe a little over half the state. So expect more above normal temperatures. And the precipitation outlook for week 2, not as strong a signal here. We've got a weak signal across the north and the eastern portions of the state for above normal precipitation. So that may be good news, but it is not a very strong signal. So it's just kind of giving us an indication that there might be a little extra moisture out there. But don't look for a great deal of extra precipitation. So jumping forward to a full month out, it's showing us a whole lot of nothing from the global circulation signals. The El Nino, La Nina, all of the linked indices that help form our climate are showing us very little indication of above normal or below normal temperature or precipitation. So as my colleague in Riverton would say, when you see this, your best forecast would be to forecast the long-term average. That's what we can tell you right now, because we're just not seeing a signal from anything else. So look to the long-term averages for what may happen over that 1 month period. Next slide. So we're going to jump into a little bit of the water supply outlook, and the National Weather Service provides water supply forecasts for all of the points that you can see on the map. And they are color coded by the percent of the long-term normal or average or median, whichever one we happen to be using. So the earth tone colors, the yellows and the oranges, are below the long-term median, and the blue colors tend to be above. The greens indicate we're in the near normal area. So across the north, as we saw in the drought monitor, we should be expecting some dry conditions. The Bighorn's doing remarkably well. That's thanks to a lot of the snow up in, I believe, in the Absarokas and the wind. The upper Green River is looking a little peaked. It's not terribly low, but it is in that 75 to 90% of normal, pretty much across the board. There's 2 down there. I don't know if that's on the Hams Fork or not, but there's a small river down there that is even drier than the rest of the upper Green. So these are for April through September runoff volumes, and the Snake's looking pretty good, and the upper North Platte is looking pretty good. So it's a mixed bag overall, and it kind of fits with this pattern of snowfall that we saw this year and we just talked about with regard to our snowpack. Next slide. With regard to flood potential, right now we're just not seeing a lot of above normal flood potential for the state. In a normal year, flooding is fairly uncommon, and in this year we've got a normal snowpack, so, and even a little below with the melt off that we're seeing. So there's just not that much. We're not seeing that high a probability of flooding. This current map is showing a 50% chance of reaching flood stage in the next 90 days. And it's showing absolutely 0 locations that we're expecting that. So right now, pretty low probability of flooding across the state. That does not mean it's not possible. If we get extreme conditions, high temperatures in the high elevations, if we get heavy rain during the peak snow melt, or we get heavy thunderstorms that really unload on us, any of those can create river flooding. But based on the long-term probabilities that we're seeing, based on the snowpack, flooding is just not a big concern at this point in time, pretty anywhere in the state. Next slide. I think I'm done.
Thanks, Tony. So we'll switch over to wildland fire potential, and our next presenter is Casey Cheesebro with the Bureau of Land Management. Casey.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Always start with this slide just because it's not, unlike some of the earlier material, I think fuel moisture, fire behavior doesn't come, it's not quite as common language for folks. So got kind of a slide here just to introduce a few terms that we'll talk about. But fuel moisture content, so when we look at the fuels that are out there on the landscape, obviously one of the main contributors to fire behavior is that fuel moisture, how much water is in those fuels. That's expressed as a percentage of the water weight compared to the dry weight. And really, when we look at that, looking at 2 main types of wildland fuel. Live fuels, obviously those plants that are alive, they're actively uptaking water from the soil through their root systems and distributing that out through the rest of the plant. And that obviously changes over a number of factors. A lot of that has to do with the plant phenology, just the time of year, when the seasonality, when they're greening up, when they're going dormant, those types of things, varying by the plant species. And then soil moisture. So a lot of the stuff you saw earlier with drought would tie to that live fuel moisture as we get into the summer. One note there is, as plants go dormant, they kind of in a fire behavior calculation become treated basically as a dead fuel once they stop uptaking moisture for the fall and winter. When we get into the dead fuels, the only way dead fuels absorb moisture is through the air that's around them, and that happens at variable rates. That depends on the size, obviously. Smaller fuels are going to uptake and lose that moisture more quickly. Larger fuels are going to take a longer time to do that. So we have what we call the time lag on those fuels. Our 1 hour fuels are a 1/4 inch or less. So you're talking really small twigs, but mainly grasses, forbs, those types of things. 10 hour fuels, a 1/4 inch to 1 inch, or small twigs and branches. So those take roughly 10 hours. There's some variability in there, but roughly 10 hours to either dry out or absorb enough moisture to not burn readily. Our 100-hour fuels, 1 inch to 3 inch, so your larger branches, maybe smaller trees that have been knocked down or things like that. And then our 1,000-hour fuels, greater than 3 inches. So you get into those 1,000-hour fuels. When we do a presentation once a month, that's a little bit more what we might focus on, right? Because it's hard for me to tell you what fire season is going to be like in mid-May by looking at 10-hour fuel moisture, because it's going to change by tomorrow. 100-hour will be different next week. So it's a little bit of a challenge there. The other thing, especially I think interesting this year, is fuel loading. How much fuel is out on the ground, and that can change from year to year, especially in our lower elevations, our mid elevations, based on just grass productivity from the season before, how much dead grass or thatch layer is out there. Weird site-specific things, how heavily was that area grazed or not, can play into that. And then as we move up into the timber, that fuel loading is obviously on a longer time frame, but a lot of times has to do with insect disease, those types of things adding to that, especially the dead fuel load in places where we've had pine beetle epidemics or other disease or insect outbreaks. Jump over to that next slide, Tony. So one measure that we like to use is the energy release component, basically how intense, a measure of how intense a fire would burn if it were to start today. And that's really just a composite of all those different fuel moistures I just talked about. So it kind of combines those different size classes to help us track that over time as we go. So that's one of the main values that we use when and trying to decide whether to increase staffing or things like that as we get into fire season. But looking at, this was in all the other slides, kind of the red, yellow, orange area, that northeastern Wyoming, the Devil's Tower, a group of weather stations up there. Looking at the blue line, there is our current ERC where we're tracking right now. Obviously, red line is the maximum value. So we're very close to setting some maximum values for this time of year. Pretty abnormal for April, well above average, the gray line at the bottom being the average over time. And then the horizontal lines there are 90th percentile, 97th percentile. And those are pretty important. We use those for some of those fire management kind of trigger points. Do we need to order more resources in? Do we need to increase our staffing, 7-day staffing, things like that if we're expecting larger fires? So pretty abnormal in April to be reaching that 90th percentile and having those conversations. Go through a couple more around the state. So this one here, the Green Mountain, Shirley Mountain area. You see the circle there on the right, but looking down there in kind of south central-ish Wyoming, north of the Snowy Range area there, and tracking a little bit above average, but really not near those 90th or 97th percentiles. So faring a lot better. Makes sense with what you saw, I think, in those earlier slides of more moisture down in that part of the world. Go through a couple more. So looking up at the Wind River Basin, I'm not totally sure what's going on. I mean, this time of year, again, hate to keep saying that, April is really an interesting time of year to be trying to outlook fire behavior, but we are in some maximum range, but we're still well below that 90th, 97th percentile. So what we would kind of consider the core fire season, we're still well below those values. So maybe just kind of a signal there that we are tracking for now anyway, well above average and really high for this time of year, but not at what we would consider critical values yet. So keep an eye on that going into May and June in that area. We had one more in there for the Shoshone. So looking at more in that northwestern part of the state, kind of that same story, tracking fairly high, setting new maximum values there, well above average, but again, not near that 90th or 97th percentile that we would be concerned quite yet. So kind of an old joke around the fire community is people always ask, what's fire season going to be like? And we generally say, I'll tell you in October, right? Because we just really don't know this time of year. I mean, it's really all depends on a lot of those forecasts that other presenters were going into, that, and especially April and May, do we get more snow? Do we add to that snowpack? I know one of the earlier presenters talked about how quickly, it was Tony talking about how quickly that can change this time of year. With one good snowstorm can bump some of those snowpack values up pretty high. So if we do stay a little drier than average here, April and May, we are fairly well set up for a busier fire season we've seen in the last couple of years. Let's go to the next slide, Tony. I think that one shifts gears a little bit. Before we talk kind of nationally there, did want to kind of hit on that fuel loading part. We had one of those earlier slides showed last year compared to this year for the snowpack. And then folks remember, I think, all the moisture we had throughout the summer last year. So we grew a lot of grass. A lot of areas around the state were green well into the summer, into the late summer even. We kind of laughed, Rebecca, one of the others that does this presentation for the BLM, that I think it was October, where Wendy, we kind of quit focusing on wildland fire. And that was actually like the first time all summer long where I think we had a little bit of fire danger because it was so wet all year. So with that, we did grow a lot of grass. We've got a pretty heavy thatch layer around the state. That's pretty hard to model on maps, or there's not a product that I'm aware of that would really show us that, but just that is present around the state. So if we do dry out and we do get some fires, that's gonna be a contributor, especially in the lower mid elevations as we go. So looking nationally, this is a little bit outdated by the time we do this call every month. This comes out the first of each month, and it's combining a lot of the other information you saw in this presentation, just at a national scale. So looking at kind of the upper Midwest being really, really dry here in April, and that seems to track with some of the fire behavior that they've had. And then the Southwest really starting to get into their fire season down into New Mexico, Texas, up into Kansas and Colorado there. And as we go into May, start to see probably some heavier green up in those southwestern areas, and so that shrinks down a little bit, but not real significantly. So looking at above average fire potential there in May in the southwest, but Wyoming staying average. So I do want to add as a caveat, an average fire season anymore is still pretty busy. So just because it's not red on here doesn't necessarily indicate that we're thinking no fires or anything. An average year can still be somewhat busy. So we'll look at June and July on that as well. So going into June, really not a lot of change there. Southwest still showing. Obviously, one good thing when we look nationally, just at resource availability, is California. When California is green, that can be a good thing. If we do get fires in Wyoming, that increases the likelihood we'll be able to get resources to Wyoming. Right, so there's fairly limited number of resources to spread around the country when we get busy, and California is a big sink for those when they pick up with their fire activity. Going into July, we do see a creep northward there, more in the Great Basin, up into Idaho, Nevada, Utah, that area. So not too far away though from the western border of Wyoming. So just because it's not showing in Wyoming, I would say that's throwing a little bit of a signal that high desert Great Basin ecosystem could be primed as we get into midsummer for a little bit more active fire season. And then, just wanted to real quick, Tony, highlight, I thought it was interesting. I think it was the other Tony with the Weather Service had that graph there of what they focus on different times of year. Pretty spot on. We did have some significant grass fires around the state in March, kind of that pre-green up, and a lot of that had to do with some of that carryover fuel load from last summer. A lot of that heavy grass loading, heavy dead grass component in Laramie County had some significant fires. Crick County saw some decent fires in that time frame, and central Wyoming as well. So that was that. Big factor there with that heavy carryover grass load, and then of course the wind that came in with some of those systems that we saw driving that fire behavior. But that's all still present. Really, what's going on right now is we're just hitting green up, and those green fuels are starting to overpower some of the dead fuel for now. So we'll be kind of stagnant here for a month or two until we'll see if those green fuels dry out or start to cure early, or if we start to get some more moisture. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Casey. And now for our highlight of the month, we have Lucy Polly with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture to talk about stress in agriculture.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to Wendy too. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you guys today. I'm just going to run through quickly some of the resources we have to help address stress in agriculture, and then my contact information should be in there. So please follow up with me if you'd like more info. Basically, you may not know this, but nationwide, ag producers have a higher suicide rate than even that of veterans. And we feel like that's kind of a statistic that flies under the radar. And so in the summer of 2021, the Wyoming Department of Agriculture had the opportunity to receive a large grant from the U.S. Department of Ag. And we got that funding to try to address 3 different issues. So the first one, we've partnered with a group called AgriSafe, and they are hosting Ag Stress Helpline for Wyoming. This is similar to a 988. The benefit of this line is that it's not just for suicide, it's for stress. They have a lot of resources. The folks that answer the line are really familiar with ag issues. So we have this line available. If you'd like some of these, we have cards, we've got posters. If you'd like to promote this line in your area, just let me know. Next slide, Tony. We also used part of that funding to provide counseling vouchers for anybody associated with agriculture. So this is a pilot project. We're hoping to secure some additional funding in the future, but right now we just have the funding until August. Basically, people can just work directly with their provider and be reimbursed for up to 6 sessions. We've contracted with Align, their group here in Cheyenne. They're handling all of the reimbursement for us. but we've tried to make it as easy as possible. There's no application, there's no like eligibility requirements. We just want people to use the vouchers if they would like to meet with a mental health provider. Next slide. We've also created kind of a network around the state of there's a lot of little pockets of activity of people that are working in this area. So I wanted to highlight one of them is a group called No More Empty Saddles, and they are statewide, and they're really focused on the rodeo community. So they have folks who provide some counseling. There's a lot of like mentor outreach. You can see their website there. You can go to their website if you have more questions, but I know they're trying to have a presence at a lot of the small and large rodeos around the state. Next slide. Another partner is a group called Beyond the Weather, and this is a partnership with Northern Ag Network and the state of Montana. And basically, it's encouraging people to check in on each other and maybe talk about things beyond the weather. So it's focused on those ag communities, and again, kind of trying to reduce the stigma, getting people to recognize that talking about mental health struggles is valid. And coming from an ag perspective, there's some really good resources. You can find their website, beyondtheweather.com, I believe it is. We're also doing some radio ads with them, and just kind of serving as another landing site for people that may be looking for resources. Next slide, Tony. If this is an area that you're very interested in, we'd love to have you join our roundtables. Just shoot me an email and I'll add you to our list. It's been a great opportunity to touch base with other folks that are working in this area, share resources, share outreach opportunities, and we've had a lot of cool ideas developed from that. In June, we are partnering on a, it's called COMET training, and I cannot for the life of me remember what a COMET stands for right now, but basically it's a way to talk to peers about these kinds of issues. And it's not, you may have heard of like QPR training, which is very much a suicide prevention training, question, persuade, and refer. COMET is kind of a step before that, where it gives you some skills on how to check in with somebody and how to, find out how they're doing, and then maybe encourage them to seek resources if you feel like they're getting to that. If you'd like to find out, it's a free training. It's going to be in Casper on June 4th. If you'd like to find out about that, please shoot me an email. And then when you're added to our roundtable, you'll hear about all the other different activities that are taking place around the state. And next slide. That's it. Like I said, we're just, doing some work in this area, trying to help connect people that may be looking for other resources. And we welcome any and all partners who want to join in. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Some good information and helpful resources there. And just like to thank the fellow presenters who are featured on this slide here before I send it back over to Wendy Kelly with the USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub and UW Extension.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And thanks again to all the presenters as well as our attendees. And we'll leave this slide up in case there's any presenters you would like to reach out to and ask follow-up questions. And I do want to just, shout out to Lucy again on these really important resources in our state. We work and live in a rural community, and as folks know, Wyoming's like a small town with really long streets. So all of our people are really important in being able to provide the support for one another. So thank you, Lucy, for sharing those important resources for our state. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll go into questions.